this is almost like a second chance for some folks. So I've seen really massive companies that, as of a few months ago, still are really lagging behind with SKAdNetwork and maybe slow down their spending, etc., which is way too late, right? Because we've known about Scan for a long time. So maybe Google is like a do-over, right? You get 2 years now, so make sure you build that team, be curious. And I know it's early for a lot of us, but like starting early, I think, is important. So anyone that missed the Scan train, hop on the PSA train.
How will Privacy Sandbox on Android change mobile marketing? Hello and welcome to Mobile Heroes Uncensored. I'm John Kutsier, your co-host with Peggy and Salton. Today we're chatting about Google's SKAdNetwork, sort of. Google's ATT, kind of. It's Privacy Sandbox for Android, of course, and it's the certainty of the deprecation of the Google Ad ID. It's also the next shoe that's dropping in the privacy revolution that is sweeping through mobile advertising and attribution. What is it going to change? It seems better than Scan, but what will marketers lose? And are there things that they'll gain? Peggy, who are we discussing this with?
Well, John, I was thinking it's almost like a comeback, bringing the band back together, because think about it. When we started, this was the topic. We were talking about a world without IDFA, and we were almost the same companies. Remember?
How long ago was it? Was it half a year? I forget. It was a year almost or something like that. I mean, it was a cool conversation. And yeah, similar topic: privacy, mobile attribution, mobile measurement, mobile marketing. Now, of course, it's Android rather than iOS.
And privacy. It stays consistent. It will follow us, John. So let me tell you about our lineup. We have Gadi Eliashiv at Singular. So Gadi is the CEO of Singular, the mobile attribution company that led the shift to Scan on iOS. He is a coder and a developer at heart, but also surprisingly skilled woodworker. And he moved recently to Austin, Texas from San Francisco. And now, yes, you guessed it, getting in the mood, driving a pickup truck and owns a tractor. Really, Gadi?
Yep.
Yep, that'll do it. Yes, that's certainly convincing. And Sergio Serra at InMobi. You were around the first time around, Sergio, and you're back again. You lead product at InMobi, where you have had no fewer than 6 roles in just over 8 years. So you either love to mix it up or possibly suffering from ADHD. I'm not quite sure. You live in LA, but you also went to school in Dubai and Italy, and his coworkers say he is super hardworking plus extremely knowledgeable. Shall we test him, John?
Absolutely. That's the point. That's the plan.
Okay, and finally we have Matt Ellinwood at Liftoff. Matt is Director of Product Management at Vungle, which of course is now merged with Liftoff. It is Liftoff. He has a unique background with history both in technology, advertising, but also automotive repair industry. So you guys can talk to Gadi there. Telecoms. And again, doing our research on our guest, John, one coworker says Matt's brilliance is only outweighed by his passion and can-do attitude. That's exciting. I want to hear more. Welcome to you all.
I'm sure he was paid for that endorsement. I mean,
I write this recommendation for LinkedIn. How will it come out for me?
Here it is. Copy paste. No, I'm just joking. Nobody does that on LinkedIn. That never happens. Absolutely not. Matt, welcome. Gadi, welcome. Sergio, welcome. This is going to be awesome. Looking forward to it. Great to have you all. Let's maybe start here. There's a lot to like in, I'm calling it PSA, Privacy Sandbox for Android. What was the most pleasant surprise that you saw? We'll start with Gadi.
Quite simply, I think it didn't suck. It's actually quite good. That was the most pleasant thing about it.
Sergio, you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I will definitely second Gadi. 2 main things from my side. One, how proactive Google was in reaching out to the ad tech players, despite what we saw with Apple. I mean, if I speak to personal experience, we have been working with Google on this for the past 2 months, roughly. And the second point is the quality of these changes. And, specifically, I'm very a big fan of attribution reporting as a functionality. And I guess we will talk more about that.
What about you, Matt? What were you pleasantly surprised by?
Yeah, one of the things that that we noted was Google's approach is very transparent. A ton of supporting documentation. They've been very frank about what the timeline is to give us a long heads up and allow for advertisers and also all of us to prepare, which is kind of a contrast with some of the other industry players we've seen. So it's nice. So that's nice. I mean, I think we expected that, but I can't say we expected it necessarily to the level that they've done it. And I think they're serious about this feedback period. Those are the things I'd illuminate just in terms of the approach that is a bit of a surprise. And I think most of us in the industry appreciate.
So it was a pleasant surprise. It had documentation. It didn't suck, as Gadi said, but of course it still needs some work. One area where you think PSA needs a bit of work yet. I'll start with you, Gadi.
Yes, we just complimented documentation. I think that they need to do some more iteration on it. The first draft was rather complicated and technical and kind of missed some things. And when we did our first kind of deep dive, we had to guess how certain things would work. But one thing I would say that Google's done amazingly, they already iterated on these docs so quickly. We've seen already like 2 updates, I think. We're kind of tracking the word changes in the doc. And they added illustrations. They even added, like, it's funny, some of the things we were guessing, they actually added up as official documentation. And I'm happy we guessed it correctly. Like, we're trying to figure out like how, multiple ad networks would work together, et cetera. So there's still a few concepts there that are, you need to wrap your head around. And so I'd say the documentation is definitely one area that, keep iterating on it would be wonderful.
Okay, Matt, you spoke about the documentation. That's what you called out as being the highlight. What about where it needs work? What's an area, Matt?
Well, again, kind of a high-level comment that I worry about is documentation very thorough, but the solutions in general, it's fairly complex. The complexity level is high. The sophistication needed to really understand all the pieces and put them together is pretty significant. And one of the things we learned, the experience working through SKAdNetwork, for example, is our developer partners don't necessarily have a tremendous amount of time to commit to this. I think that's going to be the challenge, is just working through the complexity with the resources that our marketers have to work with and getting down to it. Now, the flip side of that is, again, there's a lot of lead time built into this. But I still just kind of see the complexity itself as something of a challenge in managing the shift.
That's rather interesting because, Sergio, I just saw today, I was going through some emails I usually don't look at because I'm not a developer, but that may be one of the reasons for InMobi with its university. Do you agree with Matt that that's an area that needs some work and some clarification?
Absolutely. I think what is a bit worrying to me is the privacy APIs bit in general, right? Because it requires fundamental changes all across the ecosystem. So think of the simple fact that the auction will now run on the device itself, right? So they did mention that in the documentation, but I would be more keen to understand how it will exactly work rather than stating the SSPs and other SDKs we need to figure out, right? So I'm sure more detail and more information will come. But at the moment is what I would like to see as an improvement from PSA.
Super interesting. I'm glad to see there is some room for improvement because, of course, there's a lot there and a lot of people have been pleasantly surprised with it. One thing that's been interesting to me is that it's sending a lot of postbacks. Obviously, for individual winners, in a sense, the ad network that contributed to an install, you're getting multiple postbacks, but it's also sending multiple postbacks to contributors in some sense. Do you see an opportunity for sort of a multi-touch approach here, multi-touch light almost, either inside Privacy Sandbox or with data from Privacy Sandbox? Sergio, why don't we start with you on that one?
Sure. So I think even though Google is in the business of attribution, I think in this case, they would rather provide the tools to MMPs to actually do that. And think about, there is a specific param where you can set up multiple URLs where you want the conversion to be sent. And my understanding is that the conversion will go even like to competing networks, right? So if 2 or more networks competed and both got the install, the attribution will go to them, but then it will be up to a super partner, so to the MMP, to determine which one actually is accountable for that. And for me, this just zooming out a little bit, but it's like the whole Privacy Sandbox concept probably is a good thing for MMPs, like much better than SKAN. And I'm also curious to understand what Gadi thinks about that. But like that's my personal opinion. I think they will let someone else do the multi-touch attribution.
Let's turn to Gadi then.
Yeah, I think maybe the first thing I would say is kind of what Matt said about complexity. It is a complex solution, and some of these things you kind of need to think about for a second to make sure you understand how it works. But I also, in a kind of selfish way, I see the complexity as our opportunity to simplify, and that's kind of what we've been doing for customers, honestly, on SKAN, because SKAN is also a beast to understand, and testing is like almost impossible, and we did a lot of things just to be able to test it. But back to your question, I'm not sure if I call it MTA. So really, in a way, it depends on how you define it. If you define the ability to see multiple touch points and dedupe, then yes. And in a way, the way that this mechanism is now going to work is it's almost like every network became a SAN, and a self-attributing network. And I'll explain why. It's not so much about that the networks chose to do that, but in a way, today, a self-attributing network just sees their own clicks and views, and they kind of take credit, right? But it's disconnected from the rest. And so now this model means that every network will now only see their own data in their postbacks, which is a good signal for the network, but it's not sufficient because they don't know if they won necessarily. And that's where all the chaining that Sergio talked about, it is very interesting. And in fact, that's one of the iterations Google did. They literally called out the MMP use case, and they said, this is how it should work, which is amazing because we wrote a blog post a bit sooner that said the same thing. So basically, yes, the MMPs will play a role where you'll get multiple touch points, and then the MMP will, in a way, see all these different touch points, and the last one will be prioritized. And you can even control it based on the customer's requirements. But it's not true MTA in the form that Google will tell you, oh, there were like 20 different touch points. You're going to get all of them. There's still a selection algorithm, very basic, based on priorities. You know, do you want views or do you want clicks? Do you want and based on that, they'll choose the last one. So that's why it's sort of a yes and no. But at least you get deduping, and you can configure that. That's really nice way that they built out the API.
I love the nuanced response there. That makes a ton of sense. And also it ignores the entire outside world, right? Like you saw a billboard, a friend talked to you about it. I mean, there's so much more going on in all of our lives. But every network becoming a SAN, that's the first I've heard of that. And it's kind of interesting. Sergio's eyes are like, that sounds good. I can just claim victory on every impression. Yay. Matt, your thoughts?
The only thing I'd have to add to that is our takeaway was something that Gadi keyed in on, which was there's very clearly this continued role for the MMP within this framework. And so we would just expect for that to continue to be a driver in terms of how, advertisers and ad networks and MMPs are essentially, getting to attribution. That carve out for the MMP role was, from our point of view, like really clear within the sandbox. So I echo what he said and expect for that to be part of the go forward.
Like that we're trying to look at it in a very balanced way, but at the end of the day, it is about losing GAID, losing Google Ad ID. What's your biggest concern about that? I'll start with Gadi.
Yeah, I was trying to think how to answer that, honestly, because am I concerned about GAID going away? Maybe part of me already realized it has to happen, right? It was bound to happen. And so now it's more like you can't, I wish I would apply that logic and everything in my life, but you can't really be afraid of the unavoidable stuff, right? You kind of know it's going to happen. So to me, the first reaction was like, oh, wow, it's actually, like you guys asked, it doesn't look that bad. Given what PSA is going to do or Privacy Sandbox is going to do. So I wouldn't say concern was the first thing that drove me. But then diving deeper and also seeing what happens with SKAdNetwork, I am worried a bit about the area of fraud. So one of the challenges when you put everything in the device is that you don't necessarily have as much information from the MMP or the advertiser standpoint to observe the individual touch points because it all happens on the device. And so today with SKAdNetwork, and I would assume the same could happen with this, what if, ad networks would keep injecting views or clicks in a way and would trick the API? Like that's areas that, because it's such a black box on the device, it would be harder to debug. And that's where GAID was actually useful because advertisers could say, I expect to see the GAID. It was random enough. It was hard for people to spoof it, even though it was possible. But that's one area I would say is a concern is, fraud.
So it was fraud's a concern. It was inevitable and coming to accept it. Matt, what do you would like to maybe add to that?
I think fraud is a really good call out as a kind of a tangential or orthogonal impact to losing the ID. Some of the things that I think about recently, and I would add IP address to the conversation. It seems there's a signal within Google's framework that IP address is going to see some restrictions. We've seen that within Apple and SKAdNetwork and expect more of it. The impact there is that we have some uncertainty around is that there are use cases like fraud and others where we use some of these signals for innocuous reasons that we need them for, that's good for everybody, that we're essentially going to lose. And so, we need to suss those out. We need to find alternatives, and we need to have an answer and not, lose some capabilities or some reporting that we currently have that doesn't really, it's not a privacy issue. It's more just something that we need in the course of running and optimizing the business that suddenly becomes harder as an unintended kind of second degree consequence. So, I think that's real, and we'll be adjusting some things we know about and some things that we probably discover along the way as a result of those changes.
Sergio, do you have anything to add as well?
Well, yeah, I think the only point I would like to add here is that despite to what we are seeing with ATT, right, here is really a Boolean. So from day X, Google Advertising ID will not be longer accessible, right? So what this means is that in case of ATT, you had two types of buyers. You had the performance buyers being super proactive, trying to get their stuff in place as soon as possible. And then you had brand buyers like, oh yeah, we will try to support SKAdNetwork. Doesn't actually serve our purposes. You know what? There will be still some opted-in supply, right? And that's exactly what happened, because you see the eCPMs on opted-in supply going to the roof. And at the end of the day, brands are spending much less into opted out supply. Now, what happens here is that you will only have opted out supply practically. So there is not a fallback plan as such. And to me, either these privacy APIs work or we will be left only with contextual, which is not necessarily bad, but that's a very strong point to think about, right? And one other minor thing that to me, I'm a big fan of templates and user experience is that you will no longer be able to do creative optimization at the user ID level, which today you can do, but tomorrow we'll go to a cohort level optimization in the best case scenario. So these are two things that could be added to what Matt and Gadi were saying. I second the fraud point, but fortunately, Google also added support recently, I think 2 quarters ago, to upset IDs, which is the counterpart of IDFV, right? So that's probably something that we can still leverage from a fraud perspective rather than advertising perspective.
That's kind of a good segue, because a big change in Privacy Sandbox is targeting, right? And Topics API is one of the technologies there. Sergio, maybe stick with you on this one. What do you think of Topics API? Is it robust enough? What does it need to make it better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we can still just comment on the surface, but from what we could see, I think the idea is very good because it capitalizes on interest-based advertising that has been there like for a long time, right? But today, if me as InMobi wanted to build interest-based advertising to be siloed to the ads I can see from my side, right? Or I should say to the opportunity I can see from my side. Now, the platform doing that is much better because you will have now a 360-degree view into the user journey so far. So I think the idea is good. They also introduced some logic for making sure you cannot really pinpoint the user. And again, I think someone can just go and read up the spec. Probably we don't need to deep dive more into that. But the outcome is that you will be given topics that are very consistent in nature, or you can use for your targeting purposes. There are a couple of problems in my mind, though. So one problem is how many categories will be there, right? So I personally really hope that Android and specifically Google, being a fan of open source, will really just build on top of the IAB taxonomy, especially 3.0 is exhaustive enough. So probably for a standard consistency, it might make sense. The second point is that, of course, this might favor the big players, right? Because apparently you are given access to that specific taxonomy only if you previously called the topics API from an app that belongs to that category. So of course, the higher your scale, the higher your probability to get to see that specific category, right? And lastly, I would say adoption in general is going to be a friction. So either the whole ad tech ecosystem adopts that, or again, we will be in a position where, targeting will be very limited. Again, the taxonomy to me is key. And then the fact that big players will have an advantage. And then let's see how interest-based advertising will pan out in general.
Sergio, I really appreciate that comment, because one of the things that I've been agonizing over is generally big players in industries create change that benefits them. And I've been looking hard in Privacy Sandbox for how does Google benefit here, right? Because of course they're trying to reinvent attribution. They're trying to add privacy, all those things. And absolutely, I believe in that. I believe that Apple's doing those things for similar reasons as well. And yet, you're probably not going to do it as a market or ecosystem leader in a way that doesn't advantage you, or at least doesn't disadvantage you. Well, with scale, that's interesting. And if you can't target super well in a privacy safe way with Privacy Sandbox, which does get, let's assume, fully adopted, then maybe you have to go to the big players who have all that first party data, like a Google or a Facebook or others or something like that. So that's interesting. I want to ask you guys to comment on that. I understand many of you are in public companies and ruffle feathers and all that stuff. But Matt, back to the original question, Topics API, is it robust enough? Do you see enough in there to do the targeting that you need to do?
Honestly, right now, I think it's hard to say. I think that the two big questions are, okay, we've got an example taxonomy. What's the reach? I mean, how much scale can we drive with this? And then is that going to be knowable without testing? And then, of course, I mean, does it drive performance? A brand new targeting solution, we won't know until we get out there and test it and can find that both of those things are lacking. So it's just really just full of unknowns at the moment from our point of view.
Wow, not scary at all.
Well, I mean, certainly both of those things could come back as fantastic. It's just something that's brand new that we'll have to explore and build some testing around. I think Sergio's points about transparency and control and centralization of that data are all absolutely correct. So it's going to be an interesting one to watch.
So a lot of open questions and maybe just a wait and see. But one thing that is clear is targeting and matching of ads to humans is now done on device. So the big question remains, what does PSA change, or how does PSA change what we think of as an ad network here? I'd like to hear actually you, Matt, to start.
Yeah, I thought about this one, Peggy, and I don't have a short, pithy response. I don't know that it is necessarily going to change how we think of an ad network necessarily. One of the things that stuck out at me, though, amongst all of these solutions is the importance of having software on the device. I think that that's notable in terms of the shift to more and more on-device interactions with the framework. But, the ecosystem players and the role of the MMPs for measurement being in the place that they are, we didn't see a tremendous risk in terms of the framework, kind of shaking up the way that the pieces of the ecosystem fit together and the roles that we play, as much as a solution that would disintermediate some of those existing relationships and roles that are played. And with this Google approach, honestly, I think there's less risk of that type of upheaval. We did note that the SDK runtime solution is potentially a really big change and shift in terms of control and oversight over software that does get into the apps. And that's an interesting change. But again, if everybody's doing what they should do and are saying that they will, it shouldn't result in wholesale upheaval and changes in terms of how the ecosystem fits together.
Okay, so not massive upheaval, but some change. Gadi, how do you think that will change what we think of as an ad network, the role that an ad network plays?
I think that one of the realizations I had, because we've gone through some of this stuff with SKAdNetwork and from our vantage point of an MMP, and there were a lot of questions about the role of the MMP, etc. And I think in many cases the role of the ad network. Eventually, to make the solutions work, there's probably like 50 different mechanisms that need to operate, and if one of those mechanisms is changed from one method to another, doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of it should change or is even possible to change. And even if you read the Google Docs, they clearly specify when does an ed network or an ed tech vendor, they call it, right, needs to come in, and what do they need to supply, and what do they get back, and how they all coordinate, and where the MFP comes in. And so really you realize that what you're getting is very simplistic APIs that still need to rely on layers of value and capabilities, like, I don't know, even serving the ads, or having a concept of a campaign, or having a real-time server to respond to that on-device Google API. And, I can tell you in our case of MMPs, the amount of work that we need to do to make SKAdNetwork operable is massive, right? And so there were folks who said, oh, well, now you got an on-device database that says who won the attribution. And I'm like, yeah, that was always the easiest part, right? Like, it's everything else to making sense of the data. That's the real challenge, right? Like, I wish, all I had to do was match an IDFA to a click, but that's not really it, right? It's everything around that. So I guess the same applies. I kind of feel like it's the same for ed networks. And, if you kind of look into the API, you realize, yeah, you're kind of getting a very thin layer of capabilities that you got to build a real product on.
Sergio, massive change and upheaval, or just a bit?
See, I will give you my Nostradamus prediction, given
Okay.
on my current understanding, right? So first of all, I still want to believe that the cases where DSPs directly talk to the publishers will be limited in nature. So there will definitely be always a role of an SSP there. So with that in mind, the good news is that we already have in the ecosystem, and specifically in the programmatic pipes, a way to send multiple bids. So what I'm thinking is that there will be more transparency between the DSP and the SSP, in that the DSP will communicate upfront a set of campaigns and demand they have in the given point in time that is after specific retargeting segments or specific topics. Now, what will happen is that the SSP will get all these potential campaigns / bids, and will decide through some deep learning model which ones for that ad opportunities could be more suited, right? So what this means is that you end up sending maybe 4 to 5 responses to the device, and then based on the information that will be only accessible on device, right? That could be maybe some geo data, that could be the taxonomy we just spoke about for topics, or the retargeting segments, so fledge. Then based on that, you will hopefully get one of these bids that will be a winner based on pricing, based on relevancy. So this really depends on the criteria that will be employed on the device. But to me, the role of SSP there will be to optimize the win rate for the DSP, and the DSP will have to expose their demand. And then, of course, maybe out of these 5 bids I just told, 3 will be selected based on these contextual, actually I should say not contextual again, on the fledged segments and topics that the DSPs are after, and maybe 2 just on the contextual, so at runtime itself. So again, all speculations, but I think there will be some fundamental changes on both sides, so supply and demand.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like these people know what they're talking about. Hey, Peggy, I mean, thank you, Sergio. That is a great answer. I really appreciate it. And meanwhile, the marketers that are listening to this are going like, oh man, all these freaking details. Holy mother, these different pieces of the ad tech ecosystem and measurement. You know what? I've got a stack of cash here and I want a bunch of users there. What's going to change for me in this new reality? What will Privacy Sandbox change for marketers? Matt, let's give you first crack at that.
Yeah, I mean, the hard part is the uncertainty and navigating.
Matt, I'm looking for the answer. Nothing. It's all easy. No worries. Not a problem. We'll do everything. We'll take care of it all. Marketers just have to sign the check, and it's all good. That's the answer I want.
Well, ultimately, that's what we're going to do as providers, for sure. The here to there is interesting. I think that navigating the uncertainty is a bit of a challenge. At the end of the day, though, we're going to have a different type of postback. And we're going to need to evolve the measurement and the KPIs and understand that different type of postback within the context of what we've been doing all along. And it's not going to be the same as it has been. It'll be an evolution and a change. And it's likely to look like a performance hit early, I would assume. Again, our transition time with Google's approach is just different than what we've experienced in the iOS ecosystem. So I think the disruption is going to be less. But this is going to shift us into a way of understanding the postback data that's coming back from Google in a way that's different than what we're used to as marketers. And so we're going to have to understand it, and we're going to have to develop a point of view about our performance relative to this framework. And it's going to be a bit of a change and evolution from what we've been used to doing.
Let's turn to Gadi, and that's an interesting answer, Matt, because I mean, you don't have, you're telling like it is. It's going to be changed, and you're talking to an ecosystem that has dealt with an extreme level of change over the last year, and that's been painful. And it's been very painful change, and it's probably going to get more painful for some marketers who have sort of slipped by using probabilistic fingerprinting methods and sort of worked out, and it was okay, and that probably door is shutting, that door is closing very, very soon. So there's more change coming, Gadi. What do you tell marketers when they say, they ask, what's it going to change for me, my life, my world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a ton of implications and maybe too long to list. But if I had to provide a short answer, I do believe that if this will be done right, both by Google and us, we mentioned earlier the feedback. I think that's amazing. And we do have a chance to talk to Google about this stuff all the time. If we do this right, then not a lot should change, right? I do believe we can see a future where privacy is real and it's here, but marketers can do their job and companies can grow. And seeing what PSA offers on V1, or it's even like version draft, whatever that is already a ton. It makes me very optimistic. I don't want marketers to ignore those changes and kind of forget about it and be indifferent. They got to think about what that means for their company. But on the flip side, I do think that unlike Scan, when you looked at Scan 1.0, you almost had a heart attack. It's like, this can't support, like, this is insane, right? And then they did Scan 2.0 and 3.0, and it got better. But this is not the case. This already started great, and it's, with the few iterations I've seen, it's getting better. So I do think marketers will be able to do their job. And, more specifically, one of the areas that is most obvious is you might not be able to optimize on the device level, which is painful, but a lot of marketers do like to optimize on the things they can control, like my creative or my campaign or my targeting. And I think a lot of that will be possible, right? And so that's fantastic. And it's going to be more powerful than what you get from Scan. So yeah, hopefully, if done right, not a lot's going to change.
Sergio, let's hear your answer to this. I mean, Matt basically said the road is long and hard, but we're going to get there and marketers will be okay at the end. Gadi says if we do our job right, then it won't be that big a deal, hopefully, and you'll have lots of opportunity to do cool stuff as well. What's your thought?
Well, I think just to Gadi's point, right, I believe Google has an immense advantage, which is the second mover advantage, right? So yes, when we also, the first iteration of Scan, actually the first version of Scan, we were like, this is not going to fly. This will never work, right? But the fundamental difference now is that Google is not offering an alternative, as we said at the beginning. So what this really means is that in case of Scan, why it didn't work? It didn't work because it didn't get adopted because there were alternatives, right? So you could still have the device ID. Now Google is practically withdrawing that support. And so you are left just with that option for attribution purposes. So Google cannot make big mistakes, but that's also the best way to force into adoption of a specific product, right? So as far as the fundamental changes are concerned, I would say first one is that fingerprinting for the first time is going to be an option for sure, right? SDK runtime is an example, but then think about also the previous examples still from Privacy Sandbox, which is, the privacy budget. And also you guys might have heard of client hints, right? So at the end of the day, they are making a life for someone that wants to do a fingerprint key pretty much impossible, right? So for the first time, buyers will have to really comply to the only option Google is leaving them with. Now, is it an extensive option? Yes, it looks so. Do they have alternatives? No. So that's a fundamental change in my mind. And again, I think another change is that it kind of gives back a lot of power to MMPs. Like to me, when I compare PSA to Scan, and don't get me wrong, I absolutely think that MMPs for Scan add immense value because of the conversion value handling and all these things on reporting. But I think for PSA is going to be even more important. So definitely there are many changes in the way we understand marketing today from a buyer perspective. But I agree that if we execute correctly, there should be a smooth transition for everybody.
Okay, so not so painful for marketers if we get it right. Not so much change there. But at the end of the day, they don't just want to say, I want to acquire. They always want to up their game. They always want to optimize those campaigns. What are some of the changes that are going to be happening with PSA? Because you said it yourself, Sergio, Creative optimization is going to be different. So I'll kick it off with you. Deep dive with me here. What is going to change in campaign optimization?
Yeah, so for me, first of all, we need to see if interest-based advertising works in a good way, at least as good as user ID targeting, right? So I don't think the answer is yes. There will be multiple iterations in the way you target. Fledge is another option, and yes, retargeting so will be possible. But at the end of the day, what I will definitely tell everybody is whenever you are given an option to test, and Google will make this available to everybody very soon, right? Just go ahead and test, because today you have an organic control bucket, which is your device ID. Tomorrow you won't. So you have to take the opportunity to fine tune today, right? So that's a fundamental shift in my mind. And yeah, the other thing is that you will need to optimize based on contextual as well. And that's something that's happening already in iOS. But probably not at the scale that everybody would want to see, because again, there is optionality here. Even though the device ID is scarce in nature now, still it's an option. So you see these massive eCPMs compared to opted out supply. So these are the fundamental changes in my mind in the way campaign optimization will work. There might be of course, much higher number of ramifications, but if I was to summarize, these are the most relevant ones to me.
More testing, context being king. Gadi, what do you have to add to that?
I have to say, I agree. I think Sergio brings a really interesting angle, which is, I oftentimes, at least in my job, focus a lot on the measurement reporting, but this framework has this dependency where the adoption is not just do you use it for attribution or not, but can it really replace GAID so that marketing can be effective, even all the way from the ad network, not even just the advertiser, but can ad networks do their job? And so I think that's a really interesting point. I would like to believe that marketers will be able to, based on what I'm seeing, report on a campaign or a keyword or creative and make those optimization decisions, etc. But and have the KPIs that they're used to, and the support for longer cohorts, things that are really difficult to do in scan. Like it's funny, we just released this product that works really hard just to kind of reconstruct cohorts on scan because it just doesn't exist. So we will be out of the box, which is good. But then the question is, you have a campaign, can the ad network even target the right people to begin with? So I think that's a really interesting dependency that you have within the Privacy Sandbox spec between all those different pieces, right? Where attribution might be wonderful, but if the targeting sucks, then we're kind of stuck. So yeah, it's my only other addition here is that from a reporting style, it would look good, but I agree with the dependency there.
Quite a hurdle, because if you are targeting, fine, you're optimizing, but you don't know if the targeting is really working. Matt, what are your thoughts here? What can you add here?
Good comments. Not a lot to add from my point of view. Just to build on what Gadi said too about the good news for optimization here that I would share, the difference with Google's approach is the level of reporting that we can get that feeds back to the campaign and the creative. The restrictions are manageable from the marketer's point of view and are really signals that we need and for optimization that it's a very stark difference from what happens with SKAdNetwork to Gadi's point, where we just, have these incredible restrictions on creative and campaign level reporting. And that'll be a big win for continuing to be able to drive optimization forward. So that was good news in the mix here for sure.
That is good.
Nice. So we have to draw this to a close, and we're going to ask you each for your top tip for marketers in this emerging and growing age of privacy. Just before I do that, though, I got to hit on a few things. I mean, it's really interesting to me. We're going to see this come out. We know Google's committed to it. The GAID is going away, but there's a whole world out there that is Android open source. Or China, chunks of India, other places as well. Will they adopt that? We've seen other sort of targeting mechanisms, ad measurement mechanisms, GAID, for instance, in China, which didn't continue, right? What will we see in other areas of the world? And that maybe doesn't matter so much to a marketer in Europe or in North America, but globally, it kind of does. It's also interesting that targeting is changing, and Sergio hit on that, right? He said, hey, we're using behavioral data right now. You're going to have to use contextual data as well, right? There's, of course, intent data, which if you get search information, that works for players that do search. And there's demographic data if you have that information, first-party data, right? But that behavioral data that people have been used to with an IDFA or a GAID, that is kind of, that historical behavioral data is kind of going away. Well, let's finish off here, and we'll start with you, Gadi. Your top tip for mobile marketers in an era of increasing privacy restrictions.
Yeah, I'm gonna recycle. This might be the 400th webinar I've done on privacy in the last few years, and I stay consistent with my tip because I think it holds true. Maybe I'll change it a bit, but my tip was always like, build some sort of a task force in your company to tackle these changes because they're so broad, and it's not just the marketing team and their problems; it's the CEO's problem, and we're seeing it in the stock market as well. Like there's companies getting even, regardless of the macroeconomics, like if you're slowing down and you don't know how you're going to grow, don't ignore their problems. So set up a task force. And the only thing I would add is this is almost like a second chance for some folks. So I've seen really massive companies that as of a few months ago still are really lagging behind with SKAdNetwork and maybe slow down their spending, etc., which is way too late, right? Because we've known about Scan for a long time. So maybe Google is like a do-over, right? You get 2 years now, so make sure you build that team, be curious. And I know it's early for a lot of us, but like starting early, I think, is important. So anyone that missed the Scan train, hop on the PSA train.
The Scan train. Love it. Sergio, your top tip for mobile marketers in an era of increasing privacy.
Sure. So I think I'm gonna reiterate a couple of things I've already covered, but one thing for sure is that whenever possible, start testing. As I said, right, you have a control, experiment. So second thing is give more emphasis into creatives. Of course, user-ready creative optimization won't be possible. To me, hey, a beautiful creative is just objectively beautiful, right? So you increase your odds for at least a high level iterations like clicks and then website landing, right? And finally, and that's a tricky one, but I would say if you are a publisher, for sure, just start making changes to gather as much data as possible about your user, because first party data is going to be gold, right? And on the same side, I would say on the demand, whenever possible, find ways to plug your first party data into pockets where it's allowed. Now, again, we don't know the stance of Google. Whenever GAID won't be there, I don't know if you can use first-party data across channels, like, that we have a strong stance from Apple. But to me, first-party data is going to be gold. So for sure, you have to work with that. And last one, just stay on top of these updates because you don't want to come unprepared. So by virtue of listening to these, videos or podcast or reading up articles, it's very important to be on top.
Wonderful. And Matt, you get last kicks. What is your top tip for mobile marketers entering this new age?
Yeah, not to echo what's been said, but I would zero in on you have to budget. You have to budget for these changes. However, you're going to get organized to do it, like it's work, and you have to budget ahead of time to make sure that you commit to it what you need to. I mentioned earlier that the level of complexity here is pretty high. And that just means it's really going to take some effort to be prepared and be conscious about doing that so that you're not behind.
That is a non-obvious but very valuable tip. We've seen, and Gadi mentioned it, companies get hammered in the stock market, right? And those are the ones we see. Those are the public companies. There's a lot of companies that aren't public. They're trying to raise another round. They're trying to do whatever they expand, whatever they're trying to do. And their board is looking at them and their potential investors are looking at them, and the growth isn't there. The results aren't there, and they didn't budget. They didn't build a task force, and they didn't stay engaged. Well, guess what? Nobody's listening to this will fall in that category because you guys have provided amazing insight. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you for being insightful and also leaving us with our new motto: jump on that scan train, right? We have to do it. We have to do it with PSA. Absolutely.
And thank you to all listeners. We really do appreciate you. Hope you're enjoying it. Let us know on social if you are.
And let us know if you want to come, and we'll have you on the show. If you're a mobile hero or you know of someone who is, then fill out the interest form over at shorturl.at/JKSKT.
Also, Liftoff has a Slack for mobile heroes and people in the mobile ecosystem. There's a link on the screen, and if you're listening to the podcast, it's at info.liftoff.io/Slack-sign up. It's pretty cool. There's smart people there, and you know what? They probably need you too.
And you have probably been completely blown away by all the insights on this show, and you want your transcript, and you can have it because the transcripts are over at Liftoff's website. Go to liftoff.io, click on Heroes, and then click on Podcast.
I actually personally love transcripts because I read way faster than people talk. So that's a great way to get insights really, really quickly. Until next time, this is John Katsir. Thank you so much for joining.
And this is Peggy Ann Saltz signing off for Mobile Heroes Uncensored.